So good morning, everybody, and thank you for your time. So the session today is focused on what we call the retention challenge. So everybody will be aware that one of the biggest challenges, the biggest issues that we've got right now in the world of apprenticeships is retention. So we're seeing a large number of apprentices that are being enrolled onto the programs, and then before they get to Gateway, they're dropping off for kind of a multitude of different reasons, to be honest. So Jude and I wanted to spend a bit of time just to kind of explore what those reasons are for people dropping off program, and to see what we can do individually and collectively to try and kind of tackle that issue. So in terms of agenda, we're going to start with a problem statement, because actually I think it's quite a good way of framing the problem and facilitating the discussion. And then following on from that, we'll look at the reasons for people dropping off. So we'll use some information from kind of government reports, and also anecdotal information that we have as an endpoint assessment organisation, and also that Jude has from her experiences, which she'll talk about shortly. We will look at how we can promote the value of apprenticeships, so the value not just to the apprentice themselves, but also to their employer and actually to the wider economy in the country as a whole. Leading on from that, we'll look at how we can enhance and increase the currency of apprenticeships. So by that, I mean kind of the value that employers place on them above and beyond other types of qualification. And then finally, we'll look at what we can do again collectively to create more engaging experiences for apprentices, so that it's more likely that they'll stick in with the program and see it through till the end. And like I say, plenty of time, I think, for Q&A at the end. So Jude and I, when we ran this as a kind of live face-to-face workshop, we had about an hour. We've got an hour and a half today, so there should be plenty of time there for questions as well. Okay, so a little bit about DSW to begin with. I know we had about 200 people signed up for the webinar. There were about 70 when we started. I can't see that figure now. But what's really encouraging is we've got a real mix. I think kind of traditionally, it would mainly be training providers that would join webinars. And we've always encouraged more and more employers to get involved as well. And which really is at the heart of what we're going to talk about today, actually, is the importance of that collaboration between the different stakeholders. And I'm really pleased to see that we have a number of employers that have joined today, which is just excellent news. So a bit about DSW for those of you who don't know us. So we're an endpoint assessment organisation specialising actually in the financial services space, but more recently we've massively broadened our portfolio. So we now assess 38 standards across multiple different sectors, and also a lot of the kind of pan-sector stuff, such as HR, leadership and management, and coaching. As an organisation, we were established in 1999, really working in the L&D space with those banks and financial services firms. Obviously, when the apprenticeships reforms took place and the levy came in place, that changed a lot of the purchasing behaviours and the kind of strategy for L&D within all employers, especially large employers. And so DSW moved into the apprenticeship space, initially as a training provider actually, and an endpoint assessment organisation, but we decided to move away from the training provider space and really focus on EPA. So currently we're working with 150 training providers, offering endpoint assessment across those 38 standards. And at any kind of point in time, we're actively delivering apprenticeships on behalf of over 3,000 employers. So we've got a real kind of range of different clients and partners there. And we've been around in the endpoint assessment game basically since it existed. So we've got a lot of experience there. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you today from our point of view is based on that experience. So it's kind of, you know, real lived examples. And I think there's a lot that we can share, and that's why we run webinars like this. So I will introduce you to our colleague Jude, whose picture's not on there. I did say I would add it for sending the slides around, but she's forbidden me from doing so. So over to Jude.
I don't like my picture, but I've agreed to go on camera, so apologies to everyone, but I will get it added. So just to introduce myself, so I've been in L&D since 2007, but in financial services in particular since 1986. I was one when I joined, obviously working for financial services. In later life, I was the UK apprenticeship manager at Zurich Insurance. And I worked on their apprenticeship programme really since the introduction of the levy. think we did an impressive job at Zurich. We spent 96% of our levy last year, and that was on a variety of apprenticeships. We had about 34 at the end, ranging from data, insurance, IT, business analyst, project management, and going from level 3 to level 7. We had about 300 learners in total. 70% of those were existing employees, 30% were new into Zurich Insurance. I then decided to jump ship, if you like, and see what it was like to work in the training provider world. And from the 4th of July, I moved over to Davies. And that has been a massive, massive eye-opener for me. And you'll hear the stories as I go along, but one thing I would say, I wish every employer who deals with apprenticeship could spend a week in the life of a training provider or an endpoint assessment organisation and see how much work goes on behind the scenes and what employers sometimes, and I was one of them, take for granted, not realising the consequences, what happen. The other thing that I'm involved in, I say thing that I'm involved in, it takes up many, many hours, as Jake knows. I'm the Trailblazer Chair for the 3 insurance apprenticeships. I've been doing that for about 3.5 years now. And even though I'm working for a training provider, the Institute and my colleagues in our industry have asked for me to stay on because for me, an apprenticeship is all about the learner, all about the end person. It doesn't matter who I work for, whether I work for Davies, whether I work for Zurich. At the end of the day, I want to get it right for the learner.
Thank you, Jude. Okay, so I said we'd start with the problem statement just to kind of frame the current situation. So the problem statement's broken down into the ideal state, so where do we want to be, the reality, so where are we at the moment, the consequences, so the consequences for all of us if we don't take any action, and then finally a proposal. And really that proposal's going to be the bulk of the content today, because that's some of the real tangible things that Jude and I think that we can do individually and as organizations and collectively as an industry to solve some of these problems. So the ideal state is 67% or higher completion rates. So this was a target, many of you will know, that was set by Alex Burghardt, who was the kind of outgoing skills minister. Obviously, we've had a lot of kind of change and turbulence within government, but I'd be surprised if that is abandoned as an ambition. I think if you take a step out of the industry really, and if you didn't know all of the things that we know about some of the challenges that we face in engaging apprentices and keeping them on programme until the end, that doesn't sound like a particularly high target, 2/3. And that certainly is the way that the public, I think, would also view it. The reality is, last year, only 52% of apprentices who were registered onto an apprenticeship programme actually completed it. A slight improvement on the previous year, which was 48% completion, but we're stuck now in this stubborn position of roughly half of apprentices agreeing to go on an apprenticeship programme, in most cases, being registered, getting to, and not even actually getting to that gateway point. So that obviously, I think, in any industry is a massive problem. So it's something that we need to kind of address head on. Okay, so what are the consequences then if we don't do anything and we're just happy with the status quo and let things go on as they are? So huge damage to the brand and reputation of apprenticeships. A large part of kind of the reforms in the introduction of the levy was really driven around improving the brand of apprenticeships. And, you know, this term parity of esteem has been bandied about for years and years now. We are never going to achieve that if we're found stubbornly in this position of half of the apprentices not completing their programme. If you look at the similar stats for something like A-levels, I think something like 91% of students who register on an A-level go complete it. Yeah, 50% of apprentices don't. That is not good for the brand of apprenticeships. Poor value for money. So the levy itself is a multi-billion-pound investment. If half of that money's been spent on stuff that isn't completed, that is not good value for money in terms of the levy. It's also really poor value for money for the individual employers, especially those that have kind of co-invested. It's very poor value for money for the training providers, who certainly won't get the 20% completion payment, and depending on how early the apprentices dropped off, also will lose out on other funds. And it's poor value for money for endpoint assessment organisations, because from our point of view, we don't get anything at all. We don't charge a registration fee. We'll invest kind of time and resources in kind of supporting employers and providers and apprentices, development instruments and materials. And then if those apprentices don't actually make it to endpoint assessment, that investment's gone. And I think if you're thinking in terms of a business model, that just doesn't work for organisations. So if this problem persists, it becomes far less palatable for commercial organisations as well to want to be involved in it. It's very difficult to kind of plan your pipelines and income and finances and balance the books when it's so volatile. Disengagement with the learning process. So I don't just mean with the individual apprenticeship that person's been on. I think if you've got somebody who's maybe a school leaver, or, you know, they're further on in their career even, and they've been persuaded to go onto an apprenticeship program and they have a bad experience and they drop out of that program, the likelihood is they're going to disengage with the lifelong learning process in and of itself, and not just that apprenticeship. So that has a massive impact on their social mobility and their kind of earnings potential for the rest of their lives. Damage to productivity and GDP. So it's not just about the individual learner. It's not even about their employer or their industry. A problem on this scale is having an impact on the productivity of the nation. And we've had this productivity crisis for years and years now in this country, and it hasn't been improved by recent events. Apprenticeships were seen as one of the keys to solving that problem. And if we continue with things the way that they are, it's not only is it not going to solve that problem, it's actually going to contribute to that problem. So we desperately need to do something about it. And then we also have Ofsted interventions for providers. So there are thresholds where Ofsted will kind of take note of a training provider, and then there are also thresholds where Ofsted will go in and actively intervene if a provider isn't hitting completion targets on their apprenticeships. And actually, personally, I think that's in many instances not fair. A lot of the reasons for apprentices not completing their programs are completely out of the hands of the provider. And in a lot of instances, speaking frankly, it's sometimes down to the employer as well, but there isn't currently kind of any punitive intervention there for employers or even for endpoint assessment organisations. All of the punishment seems to lie with the providers, and providers are key to making apprenticeships work. So it's important, I think, that we kind of form a ring around providers and do the best that we can to make sure that they're not unduly punished by things which actually can be caused by all of us. Any thoughts on any of that? Sorry, Jude, before I move on.
Yeah, I just want to pick up about the Ofsted interventions for providers. I think when I had my Zurich hat on, and being the chair for the Trailblazer group, I get to speak to lots of colleagues in similar boat. It was very, very hard for my L&D colleagues to try and engage people into apprenticeships. There's a couple of things there, and I'm going to say this on this, the word apprenticeship. Some employers are frightened to use the word of apprenticeship because of the sort of bad reputation that word has got. I think we should be start to talk about them and be proud of what you can achieve through apprenticeship, and stop trying to utilise that, that word. I think it's really hard. I've now had the opportunity to see why people are leavers, and when I look at the list, many have left employer. Some are too busy, they can't spend enough time, so it's affecting their well-being. And of course, we want to make sure everyone's well-being is okay. But actually, what are employers doing to, give them that space, provide them that opportunity? What I'm finding is we do that for, I say we with my employer's hat, we do that for those in early in careers, those coming in either on a graduate programme or coming in straight as a school leaver or more importantly, as a career changer. They come into the company and we give them that 20% or now 6 hours. However, for the existing employees who already have a massive workload anyway, we're not taking things away from them to enable to upskill and to learn new skills.
Yeah.
So they're drowning in work, and something for their mental health has to give. And it's very easy to give your apprenticeship. It's not as easy to give your job.
Yeah.
And that has a massive knock-on effect. And, you know, working for Davies, and, you know, I speak to colleagues in many other training providers as well, they're being penalised for that. And it is sort of out of their control, as you alluded to. And it's got to stop. For me, the crux is we've got to get it right at outset and explain exactly what an apprenticeship is. Stop sort of trying to hide things under the carpet that it's not. Make sure that, you know, they are fully supported all the way through, so that we get really high, you know, 67 plus. I think 67 is too low myself. I'd like it a lot higher, to be on par with A levels at 91%. But I think there's a hell of a lot of work to do before we get there.
Thank you, Jude. And hopefully we'll explore some of the solutions, I think, around some of those challenges in the next sort of 45 minutes or so. Okay, so our proposal. So we've split this into 4 parts, and that'll form the core of the rest of the session, really. So first of all, I think we can't solve the problem until we understand the root cause of the problem. So we're going to look at some of the reasons why apprentices don't complete. And again, that's going to be from a combination of things like an excellent learner evaluation report, which DFE published, which if you haven't seen it, I would strongly encourage you to have a look at. It's quite long, but I've summarized some of the key points today. So really understanding the reasons why apprentices aren't completing is the starting point. Then thinking about how we can promote the value of apprenticeship. So the value that doing an apprenticeship and completing an apprenticeship brings to the individual, but then also to their employer, because we don't need to sell apprenticeships only to individual people. We do actually need to convince employers of their value. And crucially, we need to convince employers of the currency of apprenticeships. So actually, does an apprenticeship certificate mean the same to an employer as a degree certificate or an A-level certificate does? For example, I think in some cases it doesn't. In many cases it does. So we'll talk about how we can increase that currency across the board. And then finally, we'll talk about how we can create more engaging experiences for apprentices, because I think all of these things connect together. So if we're convincing people of the value in the currency, and actually we're making that experience for the apprentice an exceptional one, where it's clear what the outcomes are going to be if they stick in, and you know they've got good reason to stick in. I think these things come together to form a solution. So why all the drop-offs then? Why are we seeing half of apprentices dropping off their program before they reach gateway? Okay, so starting off with personal domestic factors. So again, this is from the learner evaluation report that I just mentioned. And some of the kind of personal or domestic factors, as they describe them, are things like mental health. What's not clear is if those mental health issues were brought about partly because of the fact that they were doing an apprenticeship alongside trying to do a full-time job and weren't necessarily getting the support and the time that they needed to do that. Caring responsibilities also featured highly within those factors. But by far the most prominent of those factors was job or career change, which is interesting. It's interesting in 2 ways. One, because the fact that they've termed that as a personal or domestic factor is a bit of an odd way to frame it, I think. But 40% of apprentices are quoted getting a job or changing job role as their reason. And actually the second reason I think that's interesting is because that's not necessarily a bad thing. In many instances, that's a success story. That person's gone on to gain a promotion, because I'm sure in most cases it is a promotion, it is a move kind of upwards for them. Yet if you look at the statistics and you look at the strategy of government at the moment, training providers are going to be penalised for that. So there needs to be a conversation and some action around recognizing that if somebody's on an apprenticeship and they leave that apprenticeship program because they've been promoted, that's not necessarily a bad thing, and we shouldn't necessarily be beating anybody with a stick over it. And I know Jude kind of, especially with insurance, actually, we've got a level 6 program there, haven't we, which can take 2, even 3 years to complete. And I know from kind of conversations I've had with employers that the apprentice starts that program maybe as a graduate, and they've been promoted, and sometimes they've been promoted twice by the time they get to that 3-year point. And even if they wanted to continue with that apprenticeship program, they're no longer in a job that actually allows them to fulfill those duties, to gather the evidence that they need. So that, by anyone's measure, really is a success story for that individual and for their employer, yet it's deemed to be some sort of a failure. So it's a really interesting point, I think. Dissatisfaction with the quality of training, that also kind of featured highly, and there's a bit of a blurred line, I think, between the quality of the training and the access to the training that the apprentices get. I think both of those things are very, very important. Off-the-job training commitments, obviously we saw some flexibility introduced there in the latest iteration of the funding rules. But I can tell you without doubt that that's still seen as an obstacle to getting somebody onto an apprenticeship in the first place. But then is a real challenge for people and is a real obstacle to them getting through Gateway. And one of the points I think that we'll probably repeatedly make is that the relationship between the provider and the training provider, and that apprenticeship agreement that takes place, and that commitment statement at the beginning, which I think is now called a training plan, that is absolutely essential. Everybody needs to understand their commitment here. And I think what often happens, what I've seen, is that you'll have, okay, here's a training schedule, and this apprentice is going to be in college or with their training provider these days. And by the time they get to month 18, they'll be at 25% off the job. But what happens is the day job takes over, and it always will. And so they're not at college that week because they've got an emergency to deal with, or there's an audit. And actually, if you get to the Gateway and you're at 10% of that off-the-job training, it's going to be virtually impossible to get that person to the 20%, because to make up the difference, they're going to be needing to do a hell of a lot more than a day of a week of only focus on that apprenticeship. So it will forever remain a challenge, even with the flexibilities that have been put in place. But I think what I would really urge in this instance is that that's very clearly mapped out from the beginning as to what that commitment is and when that training is going to happen. But it needs to be evaluated throughout the program. And if it's slipped, it needs to be dealt with there and then. You cannot leave it until the end, because that person will not be eligible to go through Gateway and they'll drop off the program and they'll become another one of these statistics. Onerous EPA requirements. So this is one really, I think, that can be fixed by Trailblazer groups and by the Institute for Apprenticeships, and is definitely getting better. Over the last sort of 18 to 24 months, there's a clear improvement to assessment plans. There's a lot more clarity, there's a lot less ambiguity, but we have a hell of a lot of legacy standards, some of which still aren't even in the queue to be reviewed. And as an endpoint, speaking from the endpoint assessment organisation's point of view, we are bound to assess what it says in that assessment plan, even if we think it's a load of rubbish and it's really unrealistic and it's not fair on the apprentice. We have to do it. We can request the flexibility or a dispensation, but often they'll be rejected, and it'll be a case of you assess what's in the plan until it's been reviewed. So we're still going to have a period of a number of years where we've got these assessment plans where it is difficult for the apprentice to complete. So an example would be, in one of the financial services standards, one of the EPA methods is a project. So they have to do a work-based project, and they also have to write a 13,500 word report to accompany that project. Now, if that person's gone through their program, they've got their professional qualification, which, let's be honest, in a lot of cases is the real reason that they're doing the program, it's far more unlikely that you're going to get them to complete their EPA if you've got something like a project and a 13,500 word report. If we can make those EPA requirements rigorous, but kind of less sort of bureaucratic, and reduce all of the kind of over-assessment that we have, then I think that'll be another step towards improving the retention. So I don't think there is a panacea here. There's not kind of a silver bullet, one solution that's going to fix everything. It's incremental, and I think it's a lot of these things done together will gradually help to improve things. So English and maths remains a barrier. I do hold a view that if you've got somebody that's, you know, through kind of 12 years of schooling or whatever, not got their GCSE in English and maths, it still feels a bit unrealistic to me to expect an employer and a trainer whose actual real focus is on the KSBs and the apprenticeship to be able to upskill them in the English and maths and to do what the school didn't manage to do in all of that time. But it is still a policy piece. It doesn't look like it's going anywhere anytime soon, and it does remain a barrier. I would say, from my point of view, I haven't seen English and maths being as much of a barrier as some of the other things that we're talking about. But speaking to other endpoint assessment organisations and other employers that we're not working with, it is still an issue. And then the professional qualifications, this is the most annoying kind of one of all, really, where it's clear that the apprentice is only doing the apprenticeship, or has been encouraged to do the apprenticeship by their employer because it's got that professional qualification in it. And this is one of those double-edged swords, I think, really, in that it's brilliant in terms of the fact that it brings a lot of apprentices, or brings a lot of individuals forward to do an apprenticeship who otherwise wouldn't have, and you couldn't have persuaded to. And it brings a lot of employers on board, because actually they're saying, right, well, we've got this levy fund that we need to pay in now. We had a strategy to give everyone in our business these professional qualifications. Let's use the apprenticeship as the vehicle. So it's fantastic in terms of getting people onto the program and getting bums on seats. But it can be very, very difficult once that person's achieved that professional qualification to keep them engaged, because they don't see the value of the apprenticeship, or because it hasn't been sold to them, and the benefits of the apprenticeship over and above the PQ haven't been sold to that individual. And then finally, and I know that this is a bugbear of Jude's, so I will hand over to you to kind of summarize this slide and give you views on this, which you mentioned it before, but it's where somebody's had the apprenticeship forced onto them.
Yeah, we've had many learners that have been employed, particularly graduates, I would say, and they suddenly find out that they're doing an apprenticeship. They take the word apprenticeship as a downward sort of demotion, if you like. They've just come out of university, done a BSc, and suddenly they're being forced to do an apprenticeship. And that's because I think sometimes we've been, and I've been guilty of this, so hands up, we don't want to frighten them off. We really want these graduates to come and work for our organisations. And we say in the small print, there's an apprenticeship, or you're going to do some professional qualifications, but we don't necessarily stress what that means. A couple of other points to pick up here, for me, is the EPA requirements. So I'm currently reviewing, as you know, Jake, the insurance apprenticeships. But what I find frustrating is there are these number of, I think there's 7 or 8 off the top of my head, opportunities that you can do as an EPA. However, as a Trailblazer group, you suggest to the Institute what you'd like and what would be fair for a learner to do, bearing in mind all of the work that they've done for the last 12, 18 months, 2 years, etc. And then the Institute say to you, well, you can't put that one with that one because that's too similar. And you come up with this time and time again. I recently changed with my colleagues the level 3 insurance practitioner, and to help with the professional qualifications, we decided to put one of the professional qualifications into the endpoint assessment. That took 2 years of conversations with the Institute to get that into the endpoint assessment. We didn't get it all of our way as a Trailblazer group. We didn't get the particular qualification we wanted in the end, but we got one in there, and hopefully we've come to a workaround that will help us. We should be all working together. For me, it's all, as I said all along, it's all about the learner. What can we do to simplify apprenticeships to make sure they are still of great value, great quality, but for the making sure it's the right thing? So when I hold Trailblazer group meetings, Jake, as you know, I invite past learners. I invite EPAOs, I invite training providers, as well as employers, because I think you need all those parties to make reforms, to make changes. As an employer, I can't, I couldn't make those changes without asking the training providers what, problems they incurred. Similarly, I can't do it without the learners turning around and saying, well, do you know what? That case study was awful because X, Y, Z. We'd much prefer a project or whatever it is. So all of those things need to come in. And I think we just need to all work better together. And that's the bit for me is why we have all the drop off. Yes, we're always going to have personal domestic factors. Yes, off the job training is an absolute nightmare for people, but we need to make it as clear and simple as possible. Robust still, it needs to meet the level that it is, but that people then can really understand what an apprenticeship is and what they need to do, what, when and how. And not have it forced upon them for people to be able to spend their levy or to, hide away from the fact that they're going to be on an apprenticeship.
Thank you, Jude. You made some truly excellent points there. I think what Jude just mentioned there as well about getting the apprentices on the Trailblazer group. I've had the privilege over kind of the last 7 years of being on kind of dozens of different Trailblazer groups and lots of meetings. That was actually the first one I've been to where we had apprentices join the Trailblazer, and it was so eye-opening and refreshing. So I would encourage massively kind of anybody that's involved in Trailblazer groups to ask your relationship manager at the Institute if that can happen. There is a lot of inconsistency still, I think, with the way that Trailblazer groups engage and are encouraged to engage with different stakeholders. Jude and some of the others that I work with currently have been excellent in that they very much have encouraged trainer provider voices and EPO voices to come together with the employers, because we don't have any kind of sinister motive to join these sessions, and we have actually been able to contribute in a meaningful way to say, well, actually that might not work because in experience this is how it pans out in reality. And it's only really with that collaboration that we can get things that work, because if we build something and it doesn't work, the machinery is so slow that if you want to kind of correct it, you're talking about months, if not years, to get it fixed. So I think getting the right people around the table in the first instance is absolutely critical. I'm going to pause just for any questions, because I did say we'd stop throughout. About 35 minutes in, so there are 4. I can actually see the question box, so I'll just I'll read some of these out. So first one, an issue I'm finding is that employers want qualified staff and want employees to get accredited qualifications, but because the levy is a tax, then lots are saying that their L&D budget goes on this mandatory spend, and so they try to force apprenticeships when standalone qualification is actually better suited. Would absolutely agree with that, Natalie. I've seen that time and time again. I think the employer is key, is probably, apart from the apprentice themselves, the most important stakeholder. If you don't have the buy-in from the employer and they're not doing it for the right reasons, I think any effort that's made by the training provider is almost wasted. So I will come back to that point of the relationship, in particular between the apprentice's talent coach or their on-program tutor or whatever you want to call them, but the person that's assigned to that apprentice by the training provider, their relationship with that apprentice's line manager is the most important relationship in all of this, because things will always go wrong, and you'll create a plan at the beginning. The line manager needs to be part of creating and setting that plan and understanding their role and responsibilities, but then also difficult conversations have to be had. It's inevitable that's going to happen, that there'll be bumps in the road, and if you don't have that relationship, say as the coach, to pick up the phone to that line manager and say, okay, I didn't get the apprentice this week, but it was a really important piece of work, it's very difficult to influence and persuade and negotiate with the employer when you don't even have a relationship with them. So it's really, really critical, I think, that those two individuals connect on a regular basis where feasible.
Jake, just to add into that one, because I really like that question from Natalie. One of the things that really, the three things that say to me, it needs to be the right time, the right program, and the right learner. So when I was at Zurich Insurance, what we had, the primary route, for example, to get insurance qualifications was through an apprenticeship. However, we would treat every single learner as an individual. If they were in our employee already, we would look at that individual, we would work them. What's their learning style? Where are they on their career path? What will be the best route for them? And some people, would prefer to have the support of apprenticeship because they wanted that coach, they wanted those workshops, etc. There were others who said, you know what, I'm one that just likes to read a book, take the exam and do, like a fast track approach to getting my insurance qualifications. And Zurich were very good at then turning around and saying, okay, you guys this route, you guys this route.
Excellent.
However, for those coming into our organisation for the first time, i.e. through a graduate programme, a career change or early in career, we'd like you to go through your apprenticeship because you get that wraparound.
Yeah.
And I think that's the bit for me. Yes, a massive amount of money, you can imagine Zurich is a large organisation within the UK. They were paying out to their levy, but they weren't robbing Peter to pay Paul. They were making sure that it was what was right for the individual learner.
That's such an excellent response, Jude. Thank you. I think that notion of one size fits all, one size doesn't fit all is really important, actually, and it's part of that candid conversation. And actually, I think from a business development point of view, for a training provider, there are false economies as well, aren't there? You shouldn't try and persuade everyone to do an apprenticeship because, as Natalie says, it's not always the right thing for everybody. So having those conversations and having a bespoke offering for each individual, I think, is critical. There's a couple of comments there from Linda, an excellent one as well that I wanted to kind of build upon. So Linda said, ours drop off because of maths and English. We deliver a professional quality on-programme training and they leave after achieving this. They're not given the 20%/6 hours off the job time. And some believe that the call goes on too long. Others aren't happy if there is a change of tutor on programme. And it's that last bit that I wanted to hone in on, because we've had this conversation, Jude, and Jude and I, we were at an employer workshop not so long ago, and this came up, particularly, I think, on the grad programmes, am I right to say, Jude, where apprentices are rotating. So what's your thoughts on that, Jude?
So it's a difficult one. This 6 hours, I think 6 hours for me is easier than 20%. I don't know why, because it roughly equates to the same thing, but I can get my head around it. The change of tutor, so I'm going to put my employer hat on first. It used to be so frustrating for me as an employer to find out that I could have a cohort of level 6 graduates, for example, going through a level 6 apprenticeship and suddenly finding out they were going to have a coach change. And then maybe 6 months down the line, they were going to have another coach change.
Yeah.
And I would get on the phone to the training provider and sort of, do a bit of moaning, it's not fair, etc., etc. However, now I work at a training provider, I'm seeing the other side, and I'm seeing that actually, at Davies, we have just promoted 5 of our coaches into more senior roles because they've done such a great job. Obviously, that's going to create a coach change. And there were part of us that thought, I took on a coach into my own area as a client relationship manager. And part of me was thinking, I want them because they're the best person for the job, but also I don't want to remove them from our clients. And that was the wrong thing. I needed to give this person an opportunity. Yeah. But I had to then have some serious conversations with various employers to say, I'm going to remove your coach. Also, coaches are in great demand. Good coaches are in great demand. So they are, it's a market out there where people can chop and change very, very quickly. So coaches are deciding to leave, go and work elsewhere, or go and change to another. It's incredibly hard But what I think training providers need to do more of is ensure consistency with their coaches, because it shouldn't matter if you change coach. Yes, everyone's got slight little changes, but I think if we could, or training providers could really focus on consistency of how a coach works, then it wouldn't have the impact it's currently having. And I think training providers across the board, and this is, it doesn't matter if it's in data, it doesn't matter if it's in leadership, it doesn't matter if it's in shop, I don't think we've quite got that right yet.
Thank you, Jude. I think it relates as well that to the point I just made about the importance of that relationship between the tutor coach and the line manager. So if the tutor coach is changing and another one's onboarded, they need to be given the time, I think, to re-engage with that line manager and introduce themselves and go through the kind of the schedule and the plan for that learner. And there's a flip side to this one as well, which we see, which is the change of line manager. And that's what I was referring to before. When we have the grad programs and it might be a 2-3 year apprenticeship, that person's line manager by design will change every sort of 3 to 6 months, and that presents the same problem but on the other side of the fence.
Yeah, and so making sure that, you know, have that conversation with your training provider and say, right, every 6 months they're going to do a rotation. Let's do another, you know, onboarding webinar for 3/4 of an hour, just explaining the program, answer any questions, and have them in every single time. I'm just going to pick up a comment that Andy's made, because I really love Andy's comment. He said, we are focusing mainly on factors outside of our control. Are we going to focus more on the rest of the meeting on controllable factors? And I want to, because that to me is really important. I totally agree that we are focusing on a lot of things outside of our control. However, we need to be able to have those conversations. We need to understand what is going on to be able to have those robust conversations, and then how we as either training providers, whether we're, you know, EPAOs, how we can support. For a simple example, we were having lots of issues with people being scared, not understanding endpoint assessment, perhaps hiding that there's this endpoint assessment at the end. So resolved, let's have a conversation with the EPAO, let them deliver a workshop up front, and periodically throughout the term of the apprenticeship. That has made a massive effect and change to the way things are being delivered. So I really like Andy's comment, because he said probably what the 93 people on the call were thinking. It's how we can have those robust conversations with the data that you've got on these slides to say, this is why it needs to change. It's not just us being negative or moaning. It is because this is the data and we want it to change.
Thank you, Jude. I'm conscious of time, because I know some people, we've got an hour and a half booked in, but some people might only have an hour booked out for it. So what we'll do is we'll continue on with the rest of the slides, and then there'll be half an hour at the end for us to answer any remaining questions. Hopefully as well, I think, Andy, a lot of the content that's coming up now will be tangible things that we can all be doing as well. Okay. So the next step then is around promoting the value of apprenticeship. So as I said, this is promoting it to the individual and also kind of to their employer. So one of the key things that I've found has worked really, really well in the past is explaining to apprentices, but also to the employers around how they're designed. And so I mentioned an employer event that Jude and I were at a few months ago, and I was asked to kind of do a presentation there. And I made this point, and you could kind of hear the penny drop in the room. And certainly one of the employers that was there said, well, I'd never actually thought of it in those terms. And that's the language that I'm going to now use when I'm trying to promote apprenticeships internally. So if you explained to people that, a good analogy is, and people always use the driver test analogy, so apologies, but it is a useful one, is I think the professional qualification that everybody's so focused on is almost your theory test. So you've got the knowledge and the understanding, whereas the apprenticeship is more about the application of that theory. So it's more like a practical test. And actually, if you were going to get in a car and get a long lift off somebody, would you get it in the person that passed both of those tests or the one who'd only passed their theory test? So when you explain to somebody that the apprenticeship itself, so all of the knowledge, skills and behaviours have been devised by employers working in their industry, that's actually quite a compelling selling point to that individual. It's a difficult one for the employer to make, because that individual might be thinking, okay, I'm a graduate fresh out of university, I really want to make it in this world of financial services. And so they're thinking bigger, maybe beyond their current role, maybe even beyond their current employer. So if you can kind of convince that individual that this program's been designed collectively by employers representing your occupation in your industry, it carries a lot more weight. So if I want to move from this bank to this bank, well, actually, they were part of that Trailblazer group. So I know that these knowledge, skills and behaviors that are described are the very things that that employer wants and expects somebody to have. I've gone through this process. I've got my certificate of a pass or a distinction that says I can do these things and I can demonstrate that I can do them consistently. That's really actually quite powerful, and I think demonstrates that there is more value to the apprenticeship than the professional qualification on its own. So shouting about the statistics, so there are some fantastic statistics in that learner evaluation report that I cited before. It's got some really good ones in, and I've jotted a couple of them down because they always raise eyebrows when I say them to people. So in that survey, there was about 5,000 apprentices who'd completed their programs. It's a very comprehensive survey. 39% of those apprentices had got a promotion after completing their apprenticeship. That is an enormous figure. I don't think there's any other type of qualification that could have, 39% of people complete that qualification and then gain a promotion pretty much immediately afterwards. And 83% of those individuals said that they got that promotion because they'd done their apprenticeship. Okay. 65% of the apprentices who completed got a pay rise after completing their apprenticeship. And 72% of those said they got that pay rise because they'd completed their apprenticeship. So if you're trying to sell kind of the benefit of completing the apprenticeship to the individual, these statistics don't relate to people that started an apprenticeship and dropped off. They relate to the people that stuck it until the end, demonstrated that resilience and that tenacity, got through the other end, and then actually they got a pay rise and they got promoted. And there are significant numbers of individuals that have said that that happened to them. So be aware of the statistics, because I think they're quite powerful tools in promoting the value and encouraging people to stick it in till the end. So celebrating success stories. So individually within an employer, people who've completed their apprenticeships, and where have they gone on from there? 39% of them are getting promoted, but where did they go? Are you shouting about that? Does the people in your organization know about that? Building in extra incentives. So this was really interesting. One of the training providers that we deliver endpoint assessment for recently received a grade of outstanding in their Ofsted inspection, and they actually got outstanding for every single category. So I thought, I want to know how they did that, and how were we able to kind of contribute towards achieving that. So I had a call with the guy there, and he talked me through their business model, and he's very, very humble actually. But really what came through is it was all about the extra kind of pastoral care, if you like, and the extra kind of added value incentives that they'd bring to that program. And at the heart of it was really them demonstrating to their apprentices that they cared about them. And so they had lots of different support mechanisms in place for things like mental health awareness, drug and alcohol addiction. And I think by really getting these guys on board and showing them that they valued them as human beings, that actually came across in the Ofsted inspection. So I think by creating these experiences and building these incentives, it does help. And again, it's incremental. Apologies if you can hear that. It's the sandwich fan outside blaring his horn. It's making me hungry. And then extolling the benefits, which we've talked about to the apprentice and to the employer. So we mentioned before standards that have got a project in. So I've spoken to employers in the financial services world, and I'm sure, Jude, you've got some experience of this, where they use that project to really kind of raise the profile of that apprentice. And so apprentices, they have to do a meaningful work-based project. So in a lot of instances, by virtue of doing the apprenticeship, it's given them access to the resources and the teams and hierarchies that they need to complete that project, which otherwise they might not have ever been able to do. And one employer that I spoke to gets the apprentices to actually present their project proposal to the board as well. And again, it's about giving them that exposure, which if they weren't doing the apprenticeship, if they're an ambitious person and they want to make it in that organization and they're starting kind of at the bottom or in the middle, well, getting them sat in front of the board, telling them about the great ideas they've got for driving that business forward is a huge selling point. It's a really important one. Don't know if, Jude, if you have anything to add to that point.
Yeah, a couple of things. So celebrate success stories. I don't think we do enough of. One of the things, mainly because of lockdown and geographically it was easier, that we did it at Zurich, was every January I would start collating who had passed in the previous 12 months. And then during National Apprenticeship Week, I would really spend some time valuing the people that had passed, pull together, invite people along, as well as all those learners, to share their stories, what it done for them. And many talked to, the biggest thing that I found was apprenticeship gave people more confidence. And I think that's something that we haven't always mentioned before, particularly in females as well. The apprenticeship gave them the confidence to apply for another job, a promotion, to do a presentation in front of senior leaders they'd never do previously. So I think having that success and doing that during National Apprenticeship Week, and also perhaps inviting training providers along to that, or a few coaches that can share their stories of what it was like in the beginning to how the learner is at the end, is massive. And like you say, in building extra incentives, yes, one company that I know actually gets everyone to deliver their project to senior leaders, the networking opportunity, and to get their face out there to show, look how good I am, I'm great for your organisation, is phenomenal. And I don't necessarily think we do enough of it. In that also, something that I've started sharing with employers, I don't think we've really celebrated not just the end of the apprenticeship, but getting to Gateway. So what I've started to do is say to employers, the following have now reached Gateway. And I know they should have had a conversation, but quite often that isn't shared with the central L&D team. It's shared obviously with the line managers, etc., etc. Look how great these people are. They have been on programme for X number of months, and they have now ready to go into the endpoint assessment. Please encourage them to, take this. You can't imagine having a child miss their A-level. It's in their calendar. They know when it is. They will turn up. It's very easy for someone to miss their endpoint assessment, miss the case study time, miss the presentation time, because they think, well, I've finished now, I've done it. So we're missing that promotion of the value at Gateway as well. Look what you've done. They're almost there. Let's just help them over that last little line, and then have a big, massive celebration.
Thank you, Jude. There's a comment in the Q&A, which I think is a valid point, saying that we've mentioned kind of grads a couple of times now, and we've talked about kind of that opportunity to promote at a senior leadership level. But actually, it's just as important, if not more important, arguably, that we improve retention at some of the lower levels. So I think some of the stuff is very tangible, and particularly around the promotion, I think, and the pay rise. Because I think if you are operating at a lower paid job, for example, or at a lower level and you're fresh out of school, those are the things that are going to be important to you, is your kind of social mobility, your earnings potential, and those statistics do speak for themselves. Similarly, I think if you have the opportunity to engage with the people who've successfully gone through that program and are advocates and ambassadors for the apprenticeship, is encouraging them to speak out. And if you do run events and things like that, as an EPO, we're asked all the time to go along to kind of ceremonies and onboarding and inductions and things for apprentices across all levels and all occupations. And those events always work best when you have a real blend of different speakers there and representatives. So people from employers, people from endpoint assessment organizations. Absolutely critical is past apprentices who've gone through the program. sometimes they can be quite critical about it and they can be quite candid about it. And certainly the ones that were at that Trailblazer session didn't hold back. But on the whole, they were very, very positive about it. And I think if I were thinking about doing an apprenticeship and I spoke to somebody like that, it would be enough to sway me, you know, hearing it from a real person and them describing what it's done for them in terms of their confidence and their career potential. I think it's a fairly easy win. Okay, so increasing the currency. So the currency really it's very closely, I think, tied to the value piece, but it's around is the apprenticeship worth the same as another qualification at a similar level in a similar subject? So iFate's vision has been from its inception that the apprenticeship is the qualification. And if you look on iFate's website and the guidance for Trailblazers, in the section around mandating a professional qualification in your standard, it's very clear in there that the intention of iFate is that there should be no need to have a qualification in an apprenticeship, because the apprenticeship itself should be the qualification. It should have that currency. I think in many industries, we're a long way off that. And in particular, I think the industries where apprenticeships aren't a historically kind of typical route into the profession. But there is some excellent work that's been done from UCAS in particular. So if you're not familiar with the work UCAS is doing, I would go check out their website, because they've got a 4 to 5 year plan around how they are transforming really the way that they support individuals and advise individuals in terms of the next steps after leaving school. And apprenticeships are becoming a massive focus of theirs, with a vision to being real, genuine parity between apprenticeships and academic qualifications in terms of where UCAS will steer individuals who are in that situation. And for the employers that are on as well, I would urge you when you kind of putting out job adverts is to put apprenticeship on there. I think until recently, it was always you required to have a degree, which is really ludicrous for most jobs. But now it'll say degree or equivalent. I don't think I've ever seen a job advert that says an apprenticeship's an entry requirement. So I think that's another tangible step. Obviously, not a lot that EPOs and training providers can do about that, but it is one for the employers on the call. Information, advice and guidance. So obviously we had the skills bill that was ratified earlier this year, which adds kind of legal enforcement to the Baker Clause, which does mean that schools and sixth forms now are legally obliged to give advice on apprenticeships to individuals and not just talk about kind of more academic routes. How successful that is remains to be seen, but I think that's in law now. So as training providers and then employers, I would encourage everybody to try and get a foot in the door with those schools now and say, can we come along to your events? Because actually you're obliged to let us know, and you have to let us talk to your learners about apprenticeships as an option for them. Improving the quality of delivery and assessment. So this is something that we're always seeking to do. So delivery on the provider side, assessment on the EPO side, and I think working together and having those candid conversations allows us to do that. By far, the best relationships that we have with providers are the ones where we meet regularly, and actually we can be very candid about things that are going well, but also frustrations. And having that quality of relationship genuinely leads to meaningful improvements. Jude's made that point, and I can see her smiling, is don't try to hide the apprenticeship. You will get scolded from Ofsted as a training provider if that's found to be the case. So even if you're working with an employer and it's clear that they're kind of trying to hide it, it's about having that difficult conversation of you need to revisit the way that you're promoting and branding this. You can actually, if it's part of a wider training program, you can call it what you want, but actually it needs to be clear to the individual that they're doing an apprenticeship. Because if they have an amazing experience and they go through and get distinction and get a promotion, but they're not promoting the fact that they gained that through the apprenticeship, then we've lost a massive win there. So sorry, I'm going quite quickly because despite me saying we had loads of time, we have answered questions that we've gone through, to be fair. So we're at the 11 o'clock mark. Okay, so finally then, I think before we move on to the Q&A section is, how do we then create engaging experiences for apprentices so that that person thinks, okay, this is a bit of a struggle, but I understand the value to me if I stick through it. And actually, I'm having quite a good time and I feel like I'm making progress and I'm learning and I'm managing to network with other people and broaden my skill set. So I've made the point time and time again, and I will make it again because this is the most important takeaway from today. is that relationship's absolutely critical. So that subtle change in the funding rules, if you look at the exemplar that's been provided for that training plan, which now replaces the commitment agreement, it does require the line manager to sign that document, because I know that what's happened in the past is you'll have had someone from HR that signed the document, he signs it and then has nothing else to do with the apprenticeship. The line manager's got no idea what the commitment is from the employer. They've got no idea what they need to do to support that apprentice. So having the employer involved and the line manager in particular involved is really important. But then having those regular touch points between the coach and the line manager to say, how's the apprentice getting on? Have we managed to stick to the training program? Can we see any bumps in the road ahead? And then kind of dealing with that before it happens, or at the very least when it happens, and not waiting until they get to gateway. If you get to gateway, so a classic example here is, say in a level 2 qualification, there's a KSB that relates to dealing with a customer complaint. You'll get the apprentice, gets to gateway, and they say, I haven't dealt with any complaints because I'm not allowed to. You know, the regulation in my employer says I'm not allowed to. It gets escalated automatically. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to fix that problem there and then, because as a training provider, you're going to have to go to that employer and say, okay, well, I need this person to deal with a complaint. It ain't going to happen. Whereas at the beginning of that program, if you can say, okay, sometime within the next 18 months, this person's going to need to be able to deal with the complaint, it's far more likely they're going to be given permission to do that. And actually, even if the answer then is still no, that's when you can come and engage with your endpoint assessment organization and say, right, this is in the KSBs, this person can't technically deal with the complaint. We can have a conversation about, right, well, what does that person do? And quite often it'll be something like, well, they do deal with the complaint, but they'll call it an expression of dissatisfaction, and they'll take it to a point and then escalate it. And it's only by addressing those things up front and having that common understanding that those things get identified and we can do something about it. If the provider and the employer haven't met and don't have that relationship, it always gets to that point and there's a problem, and it's very, very difficult to fix it. And it's very difficult to persuade that employer because you simply don't have a relationship with them. And especially if the coach has changed on program, or the line manager's changed on program. And I know it's probably sounds very easy for me to sit here and say in a very idealistic way, that's what needs to happen. But if it doesn't happen, that's when the problems occur. So I think the collaboration between providers, employers and EPOs is really critical. I've done lots of sessions actually where the employer and the provider have been there in the same session when I've been talking about the EPA and what the different methods are. That has always resulted in a better experience for the apprentice, usually a better outcome for the apprentice, because everybody's there and has the same understanding and can interrogate it and ask questions, rather than people going away with slightly different interpretations of what the requirements are. So raising the apprentice's profile. So I think where you've got things like projects and they're working at that higher level, fantastic. I don't know, Jude, then, do you have any kind of suggestions for people that are operating maybe at a more entry level within an employer, how you might raise their profile through an apprenticeship?
Yeah, one of the things that I really like, and I'm hoping, Jake, that we can send the link when we send slides, is something called Badge Nation. It's a not-for-profit organisation. I have no connection to them whatsoever. But what I found is I wanted something from a work experience perspective, because I was hoping the work experience would then turn into my level 2s and my level 3s, etc. But what could we give them, and what could they be proud of? So we've worked with a company called Badge Nation, and I know some of my colleagues have across the piece as well, where they will build a badge that will then replicate. Once you click on it, I'm not very IT technical, but imagine having that on your under your signature. Once you click on it, it actually shows the knowledge, skills and behaviors that you have had to prove to get that badge. And what I find is people then realize how much work they have had to do. Yeah. Either through work experience or at level 2, that then they're thinking, well, do you know what? I am ready for level 3, or, because I've learned this, and this. Plus it shows everyone around them, once, if, they can see exactly what they've done, and they can use that on any of their social media sites. They can use it if they've got access to email on their email link. And I think for me, what you can also do is either replicate that across your employer group, or say, as we've done in the insurance, rather than having every employer doing it and every different training provider doing it, we've gone to our awarding body as insurance, which is a chartered institute, and said, can you do it? And then we can all replicate that across.
Yeah. And
I think that is a real tool to create that engaging experience for people to understand, look what I've achieved, show off what you've achieved.
Yeah.
How many people can hold down a full-time job and get these qualifications? Yeah. Not many.
No, it is very difficult. It's a really good point actually about those digital credentials, because I'll be honest with you, when they were first introduced, I was a bit skeptical of them, and I thought, well, people aren't going to see the value in that, but actually learners love them and a lot of employers love them. And I think when you've got especially kind of programs that are a long slog, having that kind of incremental thing of, right, okay, bing, you've achieved this, and showing the detail of what you've achieved is a real motivator for people as well. So that's an excellent suggestion, Jude. Thank you. Okay, so the wraparound support services. So again, I'll go back to that provider I talked about. We've got the outstanding. That was mentioned by the Ofsted inspector, that when they spoke to the apprentices, which is a really critical part of that inspection, they were really glowing about how valued they were and the extra support that was there for them. That particular provider as well, they engaged with us and other EPOs that they were working with. And they had a real strategy for how they were going to communicate the endpoint assessment requirements to the apprentice. So it wasn't a case of you'll do a session on EPA at the start or you'll do one just before Gateway. It was actually kind of built in throughout the whole program. So there was a bit of a light touch kind of high level overview at the beginning, so they knew what it was and that it was coming. And then as they progressed through the program, became more confident and more competent, they gave them more information about the EPA, so they didn't just bombard them with all of this kind of really terrifying stuff at the beginning. And that worked really, really well for them, and that helped them to retain those apprentices, because they weren't scaring people off, but they were being clear about those expectations, but in a kind of strategic, managed way. And again, that's where it's an opportunity to work with DSW or work with whoever your endpoint assessment organization is, to do that. And that might be bespoke for cohorts that you've got, or it might be a case of, do you know what, it would be great if you had a series of EPA videos, say 4 videos. So one is a very kind of 2-minute introduction. The next one, which we'll give to them at month 3, is a 5-minute video. And then we want to give them a 15-minute video before they get to Gateway. Those sorts of things, those sorts of conversations. We all want what's best for the apprentices. So, do be comfortable and confident in approaching your EPO, for example, to request that sort of thing. Don't assume that one size fits all. Jude, I know you've got thoughts on this one, so I'll hand this over to you.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, an apprenticeship isn't going to be for everyone. It really depends, as I said before, I always say, it's the right time, right program, right learner. You may have to do something different. And also think about the duration of the apprenticeship. If someone has got, different aspirations, they may not be in that, intending to stay that long in your organisation. And we have got that, particularly colleagues in the sort of level 2 area. They are in that role and then want to move on to a different area. So just don't assume, right, I've got all these people, they're all going to do this XYZ program. That's not always going to be the case.
Yeah. Thank you, Jude. So using technology to create engaging experiences. The only thing I'd add to this is don't use technology arbitrarily. Use technology that actually kind of creates a seamless journey for the apprentice. And then a few more, and then we'll move on to the Q&A at the end. Sorry, I missed one off there. So understanding the commitment, and that ties in with the commitment for the apprentice, the commitment from the training provider, and the commitment from the employer. Okay, so paying apprentices proper wages. So I think in many cases, the apprentice minimum wage just isn't enough, especially in the current climate, for somebody to live on. I gave an example in the workshop, which I'll share again now, which is that I was approached by a family member. I live up in the northeast, who has connections in the kind of construction industry, and they one of their friends had a son, 16-year-old, who wanted to do an electrician's apprenticeship, and I could not find him an apprenticeship that he could do in the region. And I posted it on LinkedIn, and I spoke to training providers that I know, and I couldn't get that person an apprenticeship. And if I'm a director in an apprenticeship organization, and I can't do that, so how difficult must it be for a member of the public to do that? And I think tied to that was the fact that because he was 16, he didn't have his own transport, so there were opportunities that were available, but he would have had to have got 2 buses, and he just wouldn't have been able to afford it. So I think from the employer's point of view, I would urge employers to be as generous as they can with their wages, and actually from a government point of view, I think some flexibility in the levy spend around potentially subsidising travel costs for young apprentices might be something sensible to consider. So being upfront about the EPA, so building it in throughout the programme, letting them know that they're actually on an apprenticeship, not branding it as something else. This is a really key one, actually. Familiarity with the KSBs and assessment methods. There aren't many types of qualification where it literally tells you from the beginning, this is what you will be assessed on, and this is how we will assess you. With apprenticeships, that is absolutely the case. So that knowledge, that information is really, really powerful, and it's particularly important to recognise that when you look at some of those KSBs or the past descriptors or distinction descriptors, some of them are quite complicated, and so I think familiarity with them from the apprentice's point of view is actually key to retention. Because more apprentices going through Gateway, being confident, being well prepared, answering the questions effectively, they're going to come away from that, they're going to have passed, they've got a distinction, and then they're going to say, well, actually, do you know what, that wasn't so bad, it wasn't such a bad experience, and now I've got the certificate, and I've just had a pay rise, and I've got a promotion in the pipeline. It's those success stories that filter through, and again, it's just one of those small things. I think that if we can do that overall, it improves the brand and reputation of the apprenticeship. So most apprenticeships will have a portfolio in it. Start building that as early as you can. Different ways around that, and you don't want to overload the apprentice, but I think it is useful in most cases to kind of at least have the apprentice thinking about the work they're doing every day, and especially if they've done something difficult, is, can that contribute towards my apprenticeship? That's the question that the apprentice should be asking all the time. And don't just assume that a great employee will sail through. So these points really are around ensuring the apprentice's best chance of success, and also that they have a positive experience in their endpoint assessment, because it's a critical part of their apprenticeship experience, and it's a critical factor in whether or not they're going to be successful. So in terms of retention and value and currency and engagement, these are actually quite important points, even though they might seem quite sort of technical. But this happens quite often as well, as you'll have somebody that'll come through for their interview, they're very articulate, they're very confident, by all accounts, they're the best things in sliced bread in their organization. But do you know what? They didn't read the KSBs, they didn't look at the toolkit of the assessment plan, and they've just assumed that they're going to walk away with a distinction. And they're asked a question about a decision-making technique. For example, they might be great at making decisions, but they're not being taught any techniques. That they'll fail on that basis. So I think it's really important that everybody's given the kind of care and attention that they need, and you shouldn't just assume that because someone's great at their job, they're going to be great at their apprenticeship. And I think this is a really, really important one, and this is at the heart of a lot of it as well. Is, as a training provider, be prepared to turn down business. Beware of false economies. So time and time again, you see apprentices who rolled onto a program that they're reluctant to be on. It's not actually a very good fit for them in the role that they're doing. That just creates problems down the road, and it's a false economy. So Jude, I got the thumbs up from you there. So do you want to elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, this is the biggest bit for me.
Yeah.
It's really hard, and I haven't got the answer, but when you do that skills radar call, if they're going to be a good fit or not, if they're in the right role or they're not, if they really want to do it or not. We know some learners have said, God, I really don't want to be on this program, but I've been told I have to be on it. So as a skills radar, pretty much straight away. sometimes you've got to have those difficult conversations. And of course, you want to make money. I want my training provider to make money because otherwise I lose my job. But actually, I want my learners to want to do the apprenticeship. I want them to start and finish on time and actually get benefit from it. We spend so much of our time working on the people that are the issues rather than spending more time with those who are doing a really good job and are striving to pass their apprenticeship. It's a difficult one because I sit in the client relationship team. So I've got one director who wants, obviously, for me to put, new business on.
Yeah.
But I've also got my other director that manages, obviously, the coaches and everything else, that's saying, we don't want false economies. So it's how we work together to make sure. And at the moment, we're having really good conversations. And I think we're finally getting to that stage where we can say, do you know what? No, this is not. I've turned down business, quite a bit of business in the last month. It's a horrible thing to do, but it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. You're going to have a difficult conversation either way, aren't you? If you've got bad business, it's better to have it at the start and nip it in the bud. So I think pragmatically, I think what I'd be interested, Jude, what could somebody working in a training provider then who, if you felt like, I wanted to say no to this, but I'm getting some resistance, I'm just thinking out loud, I think maybe through governance processes like sort of issues logs of, okay, well, we've documented when we did this last time and this was the outcome and it really damaged our relationship with that employer, sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Having, a robust sort of referral process. So if the coach is having the skills radar and they're picking up these negativity or these concerns or issues, I don't want it just left the poor coach to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
What is in place so the coach can escalate it right the way through? Because, that's the other thing, is really supporting our coaches. The coaches have a really hard job because they are trying to make sure everyone's happy, everyone's getting through their program, doing everything. So they need to have a support mechanism in place where they can escalate, where they feel, hang on, from a compliance perspective, this isn't the right thing. And I'm sure every training provider has got that in place, but it's perhaps tightening up on that procedure.
Yeah. Thank you, Jude. I think just conscious it's just gone 20 past and we've got a few questions in the chat function. So I think we'll stop presenting now. I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll just pick up any of those questions that are left. So there was a comment in actually from Paula, which I think was a really good one. And this is something that we've advocated at DSW and sort of lobbied for. Could the requirement to apply for certification for a qualification, so this is where there's a mandated qual in the standard, be deferred to apply once they've completed? We find with HR level 5, this is the most prevalent. So absolutely, that to me, and speaking on behalf of DSW, seems like a very sensible and pragmatic and quite easy solution. I mean, the qualification, if it's mandated, is being funded through the levy. So I feel that from a policy perspective, it's perfectly fine to say we will withhold that claim. And I'm not necessarily saying until you passed the apprenticeship, but I think you should at least have attempted it. And yeah, like I say, I think that would be a fairly easy fix.
One I'm going to pick up, Jake, is from Natalie. Natalie's completed the level 5 coaching professional apprenticeship. And funnily enough, the reason I want to pick up that, I'm on the level 5 coaching professional apprenticeship. 2 reasons. One was around it practicing what you preach. If I can't do an apprenticeship, how can I expect other people to do it? And secondly, it actually made me understand myself and realize what I wanted to achieve as a person, and made me make the decision actually to move from an employer over to a training provider to take my experience here and move it to see how we can all work together going forward. I would highly recommend the level 5 coaching professional, just putting it out there, because it really gets you to builds massive confidence, helps you promote the value of apprenticeships, and helps you understand what people are going through themselves on their own apprenticeship journey, and having robust conversations.
Thanks, Jude. So there's another comment in there. So sequencing is important too, not just to Ofsted, i.e. some learners already have experience of finance, but not complaints. So yeah, I think that sequencing and that mapping out of the journey is really, really important. And actually linked to that is this idea of the RPL. So the recognition of prior learning. So there's more of a focus on that from the latest iteration of the funding rules, and clarifications really about how kind of claims should be adjusted and things like that. However, I think that at the minute, one of the problems is the focus is very much on the impact on the funding of the programme. And what's often missed is the fact that if you're RPL in an entire section of that standard, they're still going to be assessed against it in their endpoint assessment. So it's really, really important that you don't just think, right, okay, I can just ignore all that because they've got a certificate that they did a few years ago and they're competent in that part of it. Even though they've got their certificate, that will not be a proxy against the EPA. So if the assessment method, for example, is a professional discussion based on a portfolio, they're still going to need to put something in that portfolio, even though technically they've RPL'd that section of the standards. So that's important to know. And a final comment in there is I've worked for many training providers over the years to retain staff and coaches. Some need to look at their approaches and practice what they preach, i.e. management styles, motivating and well-being. Don't know if you have any views on that, Jude.
Totally agree. I never realised the pressure training providers are under. I never realised. Of course, I knew Ofsted was around. Of course, I knew that, you know, learners aren't always, you know, turning down, oh, I'm too busy to have my meeting this week, or I can't emphasise enough how I have seen how hard it is for training providers in all levels. And I think the one thing that training providers could learn from particularly large levy employers is how to look after their people from a well-being perspective, because it's hard.
Yeah,
it's really hard out there, and we've all got things going on in our own lives as well as in our work lives. And I think sometimes we are so caught up in, you know, getting them through to endpoint assessment, doing this each month, we are forgetting to look after ourselves. So yeah, I totally agree. I think that's where the table turns. There's a lot of large levy employers who have got well-being, management styles, motivation, really, you know, they spend a lot of time, energy and effort on it and are doing it well. I think for smaller training providers, that and for all organisations, actually, smaller organisations, not just in the training provider world, we're not as good at.
Yeah, I think it is really important, I think, to recognise the pressures that each of the different kind of organisations and stakeholders are under.
Massive.
Yeah.
And I don't think people, I certainly didn't realise that as an employer. I never understood what, you know, I'd feel quite confident ringing my client relationship manager and say, oh, person X, he's a bit busy at the moment. He's got a lot on his mind. Yeah. Can I take him off programme? I had no idea of the consequences of what that meant. Yeah. I had no idea of the consequences of saying, oh, can I just put that person on a break in learning for 3 months? They're having a hard time. It was only through joining David's training provider and seeing the consequences. It's like me saying to an employer, you've signed up to do something for 18 months. You're going to take 24 months, but for 6 months, you're not going to get paid. Is that okay? Yeah. You know, no one's going to say yes to that. Yeah. Also, we've set up this program so that in 18 months, we can then take on a second cohort because we have coach, you know, availability and resource. We can't do that now because none of your people have finished. Yeah. No one has understood the massive pressures, and that's right, whether it's training providers, endpoint assessment organisations, employers, learners. Everyone's got pressures, but I don't think we've been talking enough and sharing across what's going on.
Totally agree. And it's that talking piece. I think you can only really negotiate and influence people if you understand their drivers and what's happening in the background and motivating them to behave and do the things that they're doing. So really, really key point and a good one to end on. So there's a couple more questions in there, but I think we've mainly answered them, but if there are any that we haven't, we'll pop them into the email when we send the slides, and we'll put an answer onto them. But finally, I think Andy's, it's good to see, because Andy expressed the concern earlier that we weren't going to have any pragmatic stuff, but he's left a really nice comment in there saying he's pleased that we've covered them. But interestingly, he's gone on to say, I'm potentially thinking about a really interactive session, for example, with a fishbone at the heart of it, with all sharing. I have no idea how this might work, but really happy to have a go if you fancy it. We are definitely up for it.
We are definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I love stuff like that. It's really trying to get to the heart of it and not just speak about stuff at a theoretical level, but actually what can we do to make these things better.
Yeah. Just to say, in the background, I've been answering a couple. I'd said that we would share information about Badge Nation or similar, how that works.
Yeah.
And also, a lot of people have been asking for your link for all the stats, because the stats are amazing.
Yeah.
And when you hear those, I mean, I have them written on little bits of paper around my office desk, because I quote them all the time, but it'd be really good if we can share that with this webinar and slides.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jude, for joining. I think that your input is very, very unique perspective you've got of having been a Trailblazer Chair for 3.5 years, having been responsible for the levy at an employer, and now working at a training provider. Is just such a valuable insight. So thank you. Thanks, Chelsea and Stacey, for supporting in the background. Didn't have any technical issues, so I'm pleased with that. And last but definitely not least is thank you everybody for attending. We've still got 59 people on, even though we're at 11:30, so can't have been that boring. But we'll send through the slides, and they'll be on our YouTube channel soon. So have a great day, everybody, and thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.